My name is Clara, and I was 34 years old when I discovered that the smallest instruments can deliver the greatest justice, that a simple sewing needle could become as deadly as any sword when guided by hands that have finally learned the precise location of a human heart, and that sometimes the quietest acts of resistance echo the loudest through the corridors of history. The year was 1835, and I'd spent my entire life as human property on the Whitmore plantation in the bluegrass hills of central Kentucky, where tobacco grew in neat rows that stretched to the horizon like graves waiting to be filled. Master Benjamin Whitmore owned 1,500 acres of prime Kentucky tobacco land and 136 enslaved souls who worked it under the watchful eye of the most brutal overseer in 3 counties, a man whose name was whispered with terror throughout the slave quarters of every plantation within 50 miles. Thomas Hartwell was not just cruel, he was artistically cruel, possessing the kind of imagination that could transform routine discipline into elaborate torture that left scars on bodies and souls that would never heal. But it was not Hartwell's physical brutality that had carved the deepest wounds into my spirit during the 18 years he had served as overseer of the Whitmore plantation. It was his particular talent for identifying what each slave valued most and then systematically destroying it with the precision of a surgeon cutting away healthy tissue to prove his skill with the blade. He understood that breaking bodies was temporary, but breaking spirits was forever, and he had perfected techniques of psychological destruction that were whispered about in slave quarters throughout Kentucky. I had been assigned to the big house when I turned 16, selected not for any domestic skills, but because Hartwell had recognized in me something that he wanted to break personally. "You got too much pride for a slave girl," he had told me on the day he brought me up from the field quarters. "I'm going to teach you what happens to property that forgets its place in the natural order." The lessons that followed were masterpieces of systematic humiliation, designed to strip away every fragment of dignity that 16 years of slavery had left intact. Hartwell possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify the thoughts and dreams that I tried to hide behind the mask of submission, and he took personal pleasure in crushing each one with methods that left no visible marks, but created wounds that festered in darkness. My primary duty in the big house was serving as seamstress for the Whitmore family, a position that required me to spend long hours in a small room adjacent to Hartwell's office, where he could observe my work while conducting the business of plantation management. The sewing room became my prison, a place where I sat hunched over fine fabric while listening to the sounds of his voice planning fresh cruelties for the field hands who had displeased him. "Clara's got clever fingers," he would tell visitors who admired the elaborate embroidery that decorated Master Whitmore's shirts and his wife's gowns. "Shame such talents are wasted on inferior stock that can't appreciate the finer things, but she serves well enough as someone who'll never be more than property." The casual dismissal of my humanity was part of his systematic campaign to convince me that I was indeed nothing more than a tool for producing beautiful objects that would be worn by people who deserved beauty, while I remained forever excluded from the world of refinement that my own hands had helped create. Every stitch I took was a reminder of my powerlessness. Every delicate pattern I embroidered was proof that I could create value for others while possessing none myself. But the sewing that had been designed to demonstrate my subservience had also provided me with intimate knowledge of sharp objects and their relationship to human flesh. 18 years of working with needles and pins had taught my fingers precision that could penetrate the toughest leather or the most delicate silk, while countless hours of close work had trained my eyes to identify the exact spots where pressure needed to be applied for maximum effect. The sewing room was equipped with needles of every size and purpose, fine ones for detailed embroidery, heavy ones for working with canvas and leather, long ones for basting seams that would later be finished with permanent stitching. Each had its own use, its own technique, its own relationship to the materials that would yield to properly applied pressure. But I had begun to understand that fabric was not the only material that could be penetrated by sharp steel guided by experienced hands. Hartwell's office adjoined my sewing room through a door that remained open during working hours, so he could monitor my activities while managing the paperwork that documented every aspect of the plantation's operations. His desk was positioned to provide a clear view of my work table, allowing him to watch the movement of my hands while conducting conversations with visitors who came to discuss business or observe his innovative methods of slave discipline. "You see how focused she is on her work?" he would say to plantation owners who had heard about his reputation for maintaining perfect discipline among his human property. That kind of concentration comes from understanding exactly what happens to slaves who let their attention wander from their assigned duties. The concentration he admired was indeed total, but it was not focused on the embroidery patterns that decorated the fabric spread across my work table. My attention was centered on his daily routines, his physical vulnerabilities, the moments when his guard was lowest, and his position most exposed to attack from someone who had learned to think of sharp objects as tools rather than weapons. Hartwell was 53 years old, tall and lean from years of physical work, but he had grown careless about personal security, as 18 years of unchallenged authority had convinced him that his slaves were too broken to pose any threat to his safety. He kept no weapons in his office, relying instead on the reputation for brutality that had made resistance seem futile to people who had watched others destroyed for far smaller transgressions than violence against an overseer. His daily routine was as predictable as sunrise, beginning each morning at 6 o'clock with inspection of the account books that recorded every aspect of plantation operations, from crop yields to slave productivity to the punishments that had been administered for various infractions. The inspection required him to lean over the desk with his back to the door that connected his office to my sewing room, a position that placed him within arm's reach of someone who might approach silently from behind. But the most vulnerable moment in his daily routine came during the afternoon accounting session, when he reviewed the day's work assignments and planned disciplinary actions for slaves who had failed to meet his standards of productivity. These sessions required total concentration on figures and reports, creating periods of 20 to 30 minutes when his attention was completely absorbed by paperwork while I sat within 6 feet of his exposed neck. The decision to transform my sewing needle from tool into weapon was not made in a moment of sudden rage, but evolved gradually through months of watching Hartwell plan and execute cruelties that demonstrated his complete indifference to human suffering. The specific incident that crystallized my resolve involved a young field hand named Samuel, barely 14 years old, who had been caught reading letters scratched in the dirt with a stick. Hartwell's punishment for this crime against the natural order was elaborate and public, designed to teach the entire slave population about the consequences of seeking knowledge that belonged exclusively to their betters. Samuel was stripped naked in the plantation yard, while every slave on the property was forced to watch Hartwell apply heated branding irons to spell out "thief" across the boy's chest in letters that would mark him for life as someone who had tried to steal education. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Hartwell announced as Samuel's screams echoed across the plantation. "Knowledge belongs to white men, and slaves who try to steal it will wear their crimes on their flesh for all to see." But the branding was only the beginning of Samuel's education in the price of presumption. Hartwell ordered the boy's fingers broken with a hammer, each bone carefully crushed to ensure that he would never again be able to hold writing implements or form letters with hands that had been rendered useless for anything requiring fine motor control. I watched this systematic destruction of a child from the window of my sewing room, my own hands continuing to work automatically on the embroidery that decorated Master Whitmore's Sunday shirt, while my mind calculated the precise angle and pressure that would be required to drive a needle through Hartwell's neck into the vital vessels that supplied blood to his brain. That evening, as Samuel lay unconscious in the slave quarters, with hands that would never heal properly, I selected the instrument that would serve as his vengeance and my liberation. The needle I chose was 6 inches long and sharp enough to penetrate leather, designed for heavy work that required precision and strength rather than delicacy. It was not the finest tool in my collection, but it was perfectly suited for the task that I had begun planning with the methodical care of someone who understood that success would require flawless execution. I spent the following week studying Hartwell's routines with the attention of a seamstress, learning a new pattern, memorizing every detail of his daily schedule, while practicing the motion that would drive steel through flesh in the single thrust that would end 18 years of systematic cruelty. The needle became my constant companion, always within reach during working hours, always ready for the moment when opportunity would align with determination. The weapon itself was beautiful in its simplicity, a straight length of tempered steel that could slip between ribs or penetrate neck muscles with equal efficiency when guided by hands that had learned precision through years of close work on delicate fabrics. It left no marks when carried, made no sound when drawn, and could inflict wounds that would appear accidental to anyone who did not understand the anatomy of deliberate murder disguised as misfortune. As autumn progressed toward winter, and the tobacco harvest created additional pressures that made Hartwell even more brutal in his treatment of field hands who failed to meet his quotas, I refined my understanding of human anatomy through careful observation of the medical attention that Dr. Patterson provided to slaves who had been injured during their various punishments. "The carotid artery runs right here along the neck," I overheard him explaining to Master Whitmore as he treated a slave who had been injured during one of Hartwell's disciplinary sessions. "Puncture that vessel, and a man will bleed to death in minutes, no matter how strong he might be otherwise." The information was exactly what I needed to transform theoretical knowledge into practical application, providing the anatomical details that would make the difference between successful execution and failed attempt that would result in my own destruction through methods that would make Samuel's branding seem gentle by comparison. I was 34 years old, and I had learned everything there was to know about precision and patience, about the relationship between sharp objects and vulnerable flesh, about the methods that evil uses to perpetuate itself through the systematic destruction of human dignity. But I had also learned something that Hartwell had never intended to teach, that even the most carefully controlled victim could become dangerous when circumstances finally provided the opportunity to turn familiar tools into instruments of justice. The needle that had served 18 years of enforced submission would soon serve a different purpose, guided by hands that had finally discovered their true strength and their perfect target. Hartwell had taught me to fear his presence, but he had never considered that fear could evolve into familiarity, familiarity into understanding, and understanding into the knowledge necessary to end his reign of terror with a single, perfectly placed thrust of sharpened steel. The thread of my desperation was about to be woven into a pattern of justice that would finally balance scales that had been weighted against the innocent for far too long. The winter of 1835 descended upon the Kentucky bluegrass country with unusual severity, bringing with it a deepening of Hartwell's cruelties as shortened days and harsh weather created additional opportunities for the systematic torment that had made him legendary throughout the region for all the wrong reasons. The cold that penetrated the slave quarters provided new methods of punishment, while the isolation that winter brought to the plantation reduced the likelihood that his activities would be observed by outsiders who might question his methods. My sewing room became even more of a prison during the long winter months, the small windows providing little light for the detailed work that was required, while the proximity to Hartwell's office meant that I was exposed to his presence for 12 to 14 hours each day. The enforced intimacy of working within earshot of his voice had given me unprecedented insight into his methods and motivations, knowledge that was both horrifying and strategically valuable. Hartwell's approach to slave management was systematic and comprehensive, based on principles that he had developed through 18 years of experimenting with different techniques for breaking human spirits. His theory was that physical pain was temporary and limited, but psychological destruction could be permanent and total if applied with sufficient creativity and persistence. The key to effective slave discipline, he explained to a visiting overseer from Virginia who had come to study his methods, is understanding that you're not just controlling their bodies, but reshaping their souls. Break a man's spirit completely, and his body will follow wherever you lead it. The visitor, a thin man named Crawford who managed a tobacco plantation near Richmond, took careful notes as Hartwell outlined the philosophical framework that guided his approach to human livestock management. Their conversation, conducted while I worked at my sewing table 6 feet away, provided insight into the systematic nature of evil that I had experienced but never fully understood. Physical punishment is crude and temporary, Hartwell continued, warming to his favorite subject while I stitched delicate patterns into fabric that would adorn the bodies of people who considered such discussions normal business conversation. But psychological techniques can create permanent changes that make physical control unnecessary. Once you've convinced a slave that resistance is impossible, they'll police themselves more effectively than any overseer ever could. Crawford's questions revealed his eagerness to learn techniques that could be applied to his own human property. while Hartwell's detailed responses demonstrated the pride he took in innovations that had transformed routine plantation discipline into something approaching scientific research. They discussed methods for identifying individual psychological vulnerabilities, techniques for exploiting those weaknesses, and strategies for ensuring that broken slaves remained broken permanently. "Take Clara here," Hartwell said, gesturing toward my work table where I sat with downcast eyes and submissive posture that concealed the rage building behind my carefully maintained facade. 18 years ago, she had pride, intelligence, spirit that might have made her dangerous if not properly managed. Now look at her, completely focused on serving her betters, no thoughts beyond the work she's been assigned. The casual analysis of my psychological destruction was delivered in tones that suggested genuine scientific interest rather than sadistic pleasure, though the two motivations were probably indistinguishable in Hartwell's diseased mind. He viewed his slaves as experimental subjects whose responses to various stimuli provided data that could be used to refine techniques for breaking others more efficiently. But his confidence in my complete subjugation revealed a crucial weakness in his understanding of human psychology. Hartwell had successfully broken the version of myself that had existed 18 years earlier, but he had failed to account for the person who had emerged from that destruction, someone who had learned to think strategically rather than emotionally, who had developed patience that could outlast any temporary suffering, who had discovered that the appearance of submission could be more dangerous than open defiance. The needle that rested in the sewing basket beside my work table had become the focus of thoughts that went far beyond the embroidery patterns that occupied my visible attention. During the long winter evenings when Hartwell remained in his office, planning disciplinary actions for the following day, I would practice the motion that would drive steel through his neck, while my hands appeared to be working on routine mending tasks. The movement had to be perfect, quick enough to prevent defensive reaction, but controlled enough to ensure that the needle found its target in the exact location that would sever the carotid artery Dr. Patterson had described during his medical instruction. A miss by even an inch could result in a wound that was painful but not fatal, leading to my own destruction through methods that would make Samuel's branding seem merciful by comparison. As winter progressed towards spring, Hartwell's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent, as if the seasonal changes were triggering something in his psychological makeup that demanded escalation of the cruelties that had defined his relationship with the plantation's slave population. The disciplinary sessions that had once been reserved for serious infractions became daily occurrences, while the punishments themselves grew more elaborate and more destructive. The incident that finally pushed me beyond the boundaries of endurance involved Martha, a 60-year-old woman who had served in the Whitmore household for 40 years, but whose age was beginning to affect her ability to meet Hartwell's standards for domestic work. Her crime was dropping a piece of Master Whitmore's fine china while serving breakfast, an accident that would have warranted mild reproof from a reasonable supervisor, but which Hartwell transformed into evidence of rebellious carelessness that demanded severe correction. "Age is no excuse for destroying valuable property," he announced, while forcing the entire household staff to witness Martha's punishment for clumsiness that was clearly involuntary. If she can't perform her duties properly, she needs to be reminded of the consequences of failing to serve her betters with appropriate care. The punishment he devised was as creative as it was cruel. Martha was forced to kneel on the broken pieces of the china she had dropped, while balancing additional pieces on her head and outstretched hands, creating a scenario where any movement would result in additional breakage that would justify escalating penalties. The position was physically impossible to maintain for extended periods, ensuring that failure was inevitable and that punishment could be extended indefinitely. I watched from my sewing room as Martha's strength gave way after 20 minutes of holding the impossible position, her aged body finally collapsing under the strain, while china crashed around her like symbols of her failure to meet standards that no human being could have achieved. But the sound of breaking dishes was nothing compared to the sound of her weeping, as she realized that her accident had been transformed into evidence of deliberate rebellion, deserving of consequences that would mark her remaining years. Hartwell's response to the additional breakage was swift and systematic, involving punishments that were designed to convince Martha that her 60 years of faithful service meant nothing compared to the monetary value of the property she had accidentally damaged. She was stripped of her position in the big house and sent to work in the fields despite her age and declining health, while her meals were reduced to bread and water until she had somehow compensated the plantation for the financial loss her clumsiness had caused. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Hartwell announced to the assembled household staff as Martha was led away to begin fieldwork that would probably kill her within months. Faithful service in the past doesn't excuse carelessness in the present. Every slave on this plantation exists to serve the Whitmore family's interests, and those interests include protecting their property from damage caused by negligent hands. That evening, as I sat in my sewing room listening to Martha's coughs echoing from the field quarters where she was learning to sleep on straw after 40 years of relative comfort in the big house, I made the final decision that would transform months of planning into immediate action. The needle that had been my constant companion for weeks was finally ready to serve its true purpose. Guided by hands that had learned precision through 18 years of close work and motivated by rage that had been refined into surgical focus, the opportunity I had been waiting for came 3 days later during one of Hartwell's afternoon accounting sessions when his attention was completely absorbed by productivity reports that required extensive calculation and record-keeping. His position at the desk placed his neck within easy reach of someone who could approach silently from the doorway that connected his office to my sewing room, while his concentration on the paperwork meant that he would not notice movement until the needle had already found its target. I rose from my work table with movements that appeared routine, carrying mending that provided legitimate reason for standing and walking within the confined space of the sewing room. The needle was concealed in the folds of fabric that I held in my left hand, while my right remained free to guide the weapon toward its target with the precision that 18 years of close work had trained into my fingers. Hartwell's breathing was steady and deep as he focused on calculations that determined how many field hands would receive punishment for failing to meet harvest quotas, his complete absorption in the mathematics of human suffering, creating the perfect moment for administering justice that had been delayed for far too long. His neck was exposed and vulnerable, the carotid artery visible beneath pale skin that had never been marked by the violence he had inflicted on so many others. "Mr. Hartwell," I said softly, my voice carrying just enough concern to make him look up from his paperwork without alarming him about the purpose of my interruption. He turned toward the sound, his pale eyes meeting mine for what would be the last time, while his mind processed the unexpected sight of his most submissive slave standing so close to his desk. But recognition came too late to serve as protection against steel that had been guided by precision, born of 18 years' practice, and motivated by justice that had been accumulating interest since the first day of his cruel authority. The needle slid into his neck with the ease of silk accepting thread, finding the exact spot that Dr. Patterson had described during his anatomical instruction. The penetration was so smooth that Hartwell's eyes went wide with surprise rather than pain, his brain taking several seconds to process what was happening while his life poured out through the wound that 18 years of systematic cruelty had finally earned. "This is for Samuel," I whispered, as his strength failed and his body began the process of dying that would take less than 3 minutes to complete. "And for Martha, and for everyone else you destroyed with your appetites for human suffering." His mouth opened as if to speak, but only blood emerged while his hands clawed weakly at the needle that protruded from his neck like a silver thorn that had finally found its mark. The overseer, who had terrorized an entire plantation for 18 years, was reduced to gasping flesh that would soon be nothing more than cooling meat on his office floor. I watched with satisfaction as Thomas Hartwell discovered what helplessness felt like, what it meant to be completely at the mercy of someone who possessed absolute power over life and death. The needle that had served years of enforced submission had finally served its true purpose, guided by hands that had learned their strength through systematic oppression and their precision through countless hours of work that had seemed meaningless until this perfect moment. Justice had been delivered with an instrument so small that most people would never consider it a weapon, so quiet that the sound of its use was barely audible even in the silence of the office where Hartwell had planned so many cruelties. But the impact would echo through every slave quarter in Kentucky as word spread that even the most brutal overseer could be brought down by someone who understood that patience and precision were more deadly than rage and violence. The thread of my desperation had been woven into a pattern of justice that would finally give meaning to 18 years of systematic degradation. Thomas Hartwell would never again terrorize children for the crime of seeking knowledge, never again destroy elderly women for the sin of being human, never again transform routine discipline into elaborate torture that served no purpose except his own twisted satisfaction. The smallest instrument had delivered the greatest justice, and the quietest act of resistance would echo through the corridors of plantation history as proof that even the most carefully controlled victim could become dangerous when the right moment aligned with the perfect weapon. The aftermath of Hartwell's death unfolded with the eerie calm that follows, when a long brewing storm finally breaks, leaving behind air that seems lighter and easier to breathe, despite the destruction that marks the landscape. His body remained slumped over the desk where he had been calculating punishments that would never be administered, the needle still protruding from his neck like a silver bookmark marking the end of 18 years of systematic cruelty documented in the ledgers spread beneath his lifeless hands. I returned to my sewing table with movements that were slow and deliberate, my hands taking up the embroidery work that had been interrupted by the delivery of justice, while my mind processed the profound silence that had settled over the plantation like snow muffling all sound. The absence of Hartwell's voice, which had been a constant presence in my daily existence for 18 years, created a vacuum that seemed to change the very nature of time and space within the confines of the big house. The discovery of his death came 20 minutes later, when Master Whitmore arrived for their scheduled evening consultation about the next day's work assignments and disciplinary actions. His shocked exclamation echoed through the house like thunder, breaking across clear sky, summoning household staff and field hands who had never heard their master express anything resembling genuine emotion. "Sweet Jesus in heaven," Master Whitmore gasped as he processed the scene that confronted him in the overseer's office. "What happened here? How is this possible?" The investigation that followed was conducted with military precision by Sheriff Morrison and Dr. Patterson, men who understood that the death of a prominent overseer under suspicious circumstances could create panic among plantation owners throughout central Kentucky if the wrong conclusions were reached about the security of their operations. But their examination revealed nothing that contradicted the obvious explanation. Thomas Hartwell had suffered a tragic accident while working alone in his office. "Appears to have been a freak mishap, Dr. Patterson announced after completing his examination of the body and the scene where it had been discovered. The needle must have fallen from Miss Clara's sewing basket when she was working in the adjacent room, and Mr. Hartwell somehow managed to puncture his neck on it when he turned suddenly in his chair. The medical conclusion was supported by the evidence that had been carefully arranged to suggest accidental death. The sewing basket positioned near the doorway between the two rooms, with several needles scattered on the floor as if they had spilled during routine work activities. My own presence in the sewing room provided an alibi of sorts, since I had been observed working quietly at my table both before and after the discovery of Hartwell's body. "Clara was right there the whole time," testified Master Whitmore during the brief inquest that was convened to satisfy legal requirements for investigating sudden deaths. "She couldn't have been involved in anything intentional, and besides, she was always perfectly obedient to Mr. Hartwell's authority. He often commented on her submissive nature and complete lack of spirit." The characterization of my psychological state was accurate enough to convince the officials, who needed to close the case quickly and move on to more pressing matters than investigating the accidental death of an overseer whose methods had been questioned by some members of the community. But it also revealed the extent to which 18 years of careful performance had convinced everyone who knew me that I was incapable of independent thought, much less deliberate violence against white authority. Sheriff Morrison's final report concluded that Thomas Hartwell had died in a tragic accident involving a sewing implement that had been displaced during routine domestic work activities, a determination that satisfied everyone who needed official closure while avoiding uncomfortable questions about plantation security or slave management techniques that might have created dangerous resentments among the human property that powered Kentucky agriculture. But the most immediate consequence of Hartwell's death was not legal or administrative, but psychological. The slaves who had endured his systematic cruelties for 18 years found themselves living in a world where the source of their deepest fears had simply vanished, eliminated as completely as if he had never existed. The silence that had replaced his voice carried possibilities that no one dared to acknowledge openly, but which everyone understood implicitly. Young Samuel, now 15 and bearing the permanent scars of Hartwell's lesson about the price of seeking knowledge, approached me 3 days after the funeral that had celebrated the overseer's life, while ignoring the suffering he had inflicted on hundreds of human beings. His hands remained twisted from the hammer blows that had crushed his fingers, but his eyes held something that had not been present since his punishment. Hope that perhaps the world contained more justice than he had been taught to expect. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice carefully modulated to avoid attracting attention from the white family members who might overhear our conversation. "I wanted to thank you for being so kind to me after what happened with my reading." The words carried implications that went far beyond their surface meaning, suggestions that Samuel understood more about Hartwell's death than anyone realized, and that he recognized the connection between his own suffering and the justice that had finally been delivered through the point of a sewing needle. But his expression also showed the intelligence that had survived Hartwell's attempts to destroy it, the spark that might still grow into something that could serve the cause of freedom despite the scars that marked his young body. Martha, who had been retrieved from the field quarters and restored to her position in the big house following Hartwell's death, made her own quiet acknowledgement of what she suspected had occurred in the overseer's office. Her 60-year-old hands had recovered some of their steadiness once the terror of field work had been removed, while her eyes held gratitude that transcended any words she might have risked speaking aloud. "Things feel different now," she said while we worked together in the kitchen, her voice barely audible above the sounds of routine food preparation. "Like the air itself has changed, like something that was poisoning everything has finally been removed." Her observation was more accurate than she realized, because Hartwell's death had indeed removed a source of poison that had infected every aspect of plantation life for 18 years. His systematic cruelties had created an atmosphere of terror that affected even slaves who were never directly subjected to his punishments, while his presence had served as a constant reminder that human dignity could be destroyed at will by anyone who possessed the authority and inclination to do so. The new overseer, William Crawford, was the same man who had visited earlier to study Hartwell's methods, but his approach to slave management proved to be dramatically different from his predecessor's techniques. Where Hartwell had been an artist of cruelty who took personal pleasure in devising elaborate punishments, Crawford was a businessman who understood that terrorized slaves were less productive than those who were treated with basic decency. "I'm here to manage agricultural operations, not to provide entertainment through innovative disciplinary techniques," he announced during his first address to the plantation's slave population. "Work hard, follow reasonable orders, and you'll find me a fair supervisor who rewards productivity rather than punishing creativity." The contrast between the two men was immediately apparent to everyone who had suffered under Hartwell's reign of systematic terror. Crawford's discipline was swift and practical when necessary, but it lacked the elaborate psychological dimensions that had made his predecessor's punishments so devastating to human spirits. The change in plantation atmosphere was so dramatic that some of the older slaves wept openly during his first week of management, overwhelmed by the simple experience of being treated as human beings rather than as objects for experimental torture. But perhaps most importantly, Hartwell's elimination had demonstrated that even the most brutal overseer was vulnerable to resistance that took forms they never anticipated. The sewing needle that had ended his life was so ordinary, so innocent in appearance, so completely integrated into the normal activities of plantation domestic work that no security measures could have prevented its use as a weapon by someone who understood both its potential and the anatomy of its target. Word of Hartwell's death spread through slave networks throughout Kentucky and beyond, carrying knowledge that transcended the official explanation of accidental death. The story that was whispered in slave quarters emphasized not the medical details of how he had died, but the demonstration that careful planning and perfect timing could eliminate sources of systematic cruelty even when conventional resistance seemed impossible. "Heard tell that overseer in Lexington fell down some stairs and broke his neck," reported a field hand whose cousin worked on a neighboring plantation. "Strangest thing, he was known for being real careful about where he walked, never had accidents before. But sometimes accidents just happen to people who've been asking for them long enough." The pattern was becoming recognizable to those who understood what to look for. Cruel overseers and brutal masters throughout the region were experiencing accidents that involved common household items, tools that were so ordinary they attracted no suspicion until they were found protruding from bodies that had been discovered in circumstances that suggested tragic mishaps rather than deliberate violence. As spring approached and the first anniversary of Hartwell's death drew near, I often found myself working in the sewing room, where justice had finally been served after 18 years of systematic cruelty. The needle that had delivered that justice had been buried with its victim, but my sewing basket contained dozens of others that were equally sharp, equally precise, equally capable of finding vital targets when guided by hands that had learned their deadly potential. The silence that had replaced Hartwell's voice continued to echo through the plantation, like a promise that some forms of evil could indeed be eliminated by those who possessed the patience to wait for perfect opportunities and the skill to recognize them when they arrived. His death had transformed me from victim into victor, from property into person, from someone who endured suffering into someone who had finally learned to prevent it through methods that left no evidence for investigation. I was 35 years old, and I had discovered that the smallest instruments could indeed deliver the greatest justice, that quiet acts of resistance could echo louder than any public rebellion, that a simple sewing needle could become as deadly as any sword when guided by hands that had finally learned the precise location of a human heart and the perfect moment to pierce it. The thread of my desperation had been woven into a pattern of liberation that would inspire others who found themselves trapped in circumstances that seemed impossible to escape. Thomas Hartwell's death had proven that even the most carefully controlled victim could become dangerous when the right tools aligned with the perfect opportunity, and that lesson was spreading through networks that connected enslaved communities across the entire region. Justice had been served with precision that left no room for doubt about its effectiveness, while the instrument of its delivery remained so innocent in appearance that no amount of security could protect future oppressors from similar fates when their victims finally learned to see ordinary objects as weapons of liberation waiting to be employed. The spring of 1836 brought with it a transformation of the Whitmore plantation that went far beyond the simple replacement of one overseer with another. Crawford's management style had eliminated the systematic terror that had defined daily existence under Hartwell's authority, but more importantly, the knowledge that even the most brutal oppressor could be eliminated through careful planning and precise action had fundamentally changed the psychological landscape of slavery throughout central Kentucky. I continued my work in the sewing room where justice had been delivered with surgical precision, but my role had evolved beyond mere domestic service into something approaching leadership among the plantation's slave community. The other enslaved people looked to me with a respect that had nothing to do with official authority, and everything to do with the understanding that I had demonstrated forms of resistance that transcended conventional rebellion. The sewing needles in my basket were no longer simple tools for embroidery and mending, but symbols of possibilities that had been hidden in plain sight for generations. Every slave who worked in close proximity to white authority understood that they handled potential weapons daily: kitchen knives, garden tools, household implements that could be transformed from instruments of service into means of liberation by someone who possessed the knowledge and determination necessary to employ them effectively. Young Samuel had become my informal apprentice in what we carefully called precision work, though the skills he was learning went far beyond the embroidery techniques that provided cover for our real instruction. His hands, permanently damaged by Hartwell's hammer blows, could no longer perform the fine motor control required for detailed needlework, but they had retained enough dexterity to learn the anatomical knowledge that made domestic tools deadly when properly applied. The important thing is understanding exactly where to apply pressure, I explained during one of our evening sessions in the sewing room, using fabric samples to demonstrate principles that could be applied to more vital targets. Whether you're working with silk or other materials, success requires precision rather than force. Samuel's intelligence had not only survived Hartwell's attempts to destroy it, but had been refined by suffering into something harder and more focused than mere academic curiosity. He understood the coded nature of our instruction, the way that lessons in household management contained information that could be applied to problems that went far beyond domestic concerns. "Martha, Restored to her position in the big house but bearing psychological scars from her brief exile to fieldwork, served as our intelligence coordinator, gathering information about the movements and vulnerabilities of white authority figures while maintaining the facade of subservient domestic service that made such observation possible. Master Whitmore's been receiving letters from other plantation owners, she reported during one of our carefully disguised planning sessions. They're worried about what they're calling a pattern of accidents among overseers throughout the region. 7 men dead in the past year, all from mishaps involving common household items. The information confirmed what I had begun to suspect about the broader impact of Hartwell's elimination. The knowledge that had made his death possible was spreading through slave networks faster than white authorities could recognize or suppress it, carried by the same invisible communication systems that had always connected enslaved communities across vast distances. The accidents that were claiming cruel overseers throughout Kentucky and beyond were following patterns that would have been recognizable to anyone who understood what to look for. Men who had built their reputations on innovative cruelties, found dead in circumstances that involved tools so ordinary that no security measures could have prevented their use as weapons by someone with sufficient anatomical knowledge and perfect timing. Crawford's management of the Whitmore plantation had eliminated the immediate source of systematic terror, but it had also created opportunities for sharing knowledge that could address similar problems on properties where slaves still lived under the authority of men who viewed human suffering as entertainment. The network that was developing had no formal structure or central leadership, but it possessed something more powerful, a common understanding that resistance could take forms that their oppressors never anticipated. "Heard from my sister at the Morrison place," reported James, a field hand whose family connections provided intelligence about conditions on neighboring plantations. Their overseer, man named Hutchins, who was famous for his water punishments, fell into a well last week. Real strange, since he was known for being careful around deep water. The death of Hutchins was particularly significant because his methods had been similar to those that other overseers throughout the region had employed to terrorize slaves who showed signs of independence. The elimination of men who specialized in aquatic discipline, following so closely after the deaths of those known for other forms of innovative cruelty, suggested coordination that went beyond coincidence. But the most important development was not the elimination of individual oppressors, but the psychological transformation that was occurring among slaves who had learned that even the most brutal authority could be challenged successfully. The knowledge that resistance was possible, that careful planning could overcome advantages of size and strength and legal authority, was spreading through slave communities like wildfire consuming dried grass. My own role in this transformation was necessarily covert, limited to sharing principles rather than specific techniques, observations rather than direct instruction. But the sewing room where Hartwell had died had become an informal academy where trusted individuals could learn about precision and anatomy, timing and opportunity, the ways that ordinary objects could serve extraordinary purposes when employed by someone who understood their potential. The key to any successful household management, I would explain during sessions that appeared to focus on domestic skills, is understanding that every tool has multiple applications and that the most effective results often come from approaches that others would never consider. The instruction was necessarily subtle and coded, but those who heard it understood that we were discussing more than needlework and fabric care. We were sharing knowledge about power and vulnerability, about the ways that apparent weakness could be transformed into strategic advantage by someone who possessed the patience to wait for perfect opportunities. As word of Hartwell's death and its circumstances continued to spread through underground networks, I began receiving visitors from other plantations, women who claimed to be seeking instruction in advanced embroidery techniques, but who were actually looking for knowledge that could address problems similar to those that had once made my own existence unbearable. "I've heard you're skilled at working with difficult materials," said Rebecca, a house slave from a tobacco plantation near Frankfurt, where the overseer was known for his creative punishments involving heated implements. "I wondered if you might share some techniques for handling projects that require special precision." The conversations that followed were masterpieces of coded communication, discussions about needlework that contained information about anatomy, fabric care that included lessons about timing and opportunity, domestic management that provided principles for eliminating obstacles to efficient household operation. But those who participated understood that we were sharing knowledge that transcended conventional domestic skills. The network that was developing had begun to affect the behavior of overseers and masters throughout central Kentucky, men who were becoming aware that their positions might not provide the security they had always assumed was guaranteed by law and custom. The mysterious deaths that were claiming their colleagues had created an atmosphere of uncertainty that was changing the nature of plantation discipline throughout the region. "Crawford's been asking questions about household security," Martha reported during one of our intelligence sessions. "Wants to know if we've noticed anything unusual, anyone who might pose a threat to plantation management. Says Master Whitmore is concerned about reports of violence against supervisory personnel." The investigation was both predictable and futile because the resistance they were trying to identify operated through methods that left no evidence for conventional detection. The tools that were being used as weapons were so integrated into normal plantation operations that their potential for violence remained invisible until the moment of their employment, while the knowledge that made such employment possible was being transmitted through networks that had always existed beneath the notice of white observation. But the questions also revealed growing awareness among plantation owners that their authority was being challenged in ways they had never anticipated. The systematic elimination of cruel overseers was creating labor management problems that went beyond simple replacement of personnel, because qualified men were becoming reluctant to accept positions that seemed to carry unusual risks of accidental death. "Can't find decent supervisors anymore," complained Colonel Harrison during a conversation with Master Whitmore that I overheard while serving dinner. "Word's gotten out about these accidents, and experienced men are demanding hazard pay for taking positions that used to be considered safe and profitable." The economic impact of the resistance was exactly what I had hoped might result from demonstrating that even the most brutal authority could be eliminated through careful planning and precise action. The supply of qualified overseers was beginning to dry up, as men who might once have competed for such positions decided that the risks outweighed the benefits, creating pressures that were forcing plantation owners to reconsider their approach to labor management. More importantly, the knowledge that resistance was possible was transforming the psychology of slavery throughout the region. Slaves who had once accepted their circumstances as unchangeable were beginning to understand that oppression created its own vulnerabilities, that careful observation could reveal weaknesses in even the most carefully constructed systems of control. The sewing needle that had ended Hartwell's reign of terror had become a symbol that extended far beyond its original purpose, representing the principle that the smallest instruments could deliver the greatest justice when guided by hands that had learned precision through years of patient practice. But it also represented something more fundamental, the recognition that victims could become victors, that property could become people, that resistance could take forms that no amount of security could prevent. As the first anniversary of Hartwell's death approached, I reflected on the changes that had transformed not just the Whitmore plantation, but the entire landscape of slavery in central Kentucky. The systematic terror that had once defined plantation life was giving way to something approaching mutual respect between owners and owned, while the creative cruelties that had once passed for innovative management were being abandoned in favor of basic decency motivated by enlightened self-interest. The thread of my desperation had been woven into a pattern that extended far beyond my own circumstances, connecting slaves throughout the region in a network of shared knowledge about precision and opportunity, timing and anatomy, the ways that ordinary objects could serve extraordinary purposes when employed by someone who understood their deadly potential. Thomas Hartwell's death had proven that even the most carefully controlled victim could become dangerous when the right moment aligned with the perfect weapon, and that lesson was spreading through communities that had been waiting generations for someone to demonstrate that resistance was indeed possible, for those who possessed the intelligence and determination necessary to recognize opportunities when they appeared. The needle's echo would continue to resonate through the corridors of plantation history, reminding future generations that justice could be delivered with instruments so small that most people would never consider them weapons, so quiet that the sound of their use was barely audible, but so effective that their impact would transform the fundamental nature of the relationship between oppressor and oppressed. The winter of 1837 marked the second anniversary of Thomas Hartwell's death, and with it came the full flowering of changes that had been seeded by that single act of precisely delivered justice in the sewing room of the Whitmore plantation. The knowledge that had made his elimination possible had spread throughout the slave communities of Kentucky and beyond, carried by networks that connected plantations across hundreds of miles while remaining invisible to the white authorities who were increasingly concerned about what they called the epidemic of accidents affecting plantation management personnel. I continued my work as seamstress for the Whitmore family, but my true occupation had evolved into something that would have horrified the people who depended on my skill with needle and thread for their finest garments. The sewing room where Hartwell had breathed his last had become an informal academy where trusted individuals learned principles that transcended conventional domestic instruction, where lessons in precision and anatomy were disguised as discussions of embroidery techniques and fabric care. The transformation was most apparent in the changed behavior of plantation owners throughout central Kentucky. Men who had once competed to hire overseers known for their innovative cruelties, but who now sought supervisors whose reputations emphasized efficiency and productivity rather than creative punishment techniques. The supply of qualified candidates for overseer positions had contracted dramatically as word spread about the mysterious accidents that seemed to claim men who had built their careers on systematic brutality. Crawford's management of the Whitmore plantation had evolved into a model that other owners were beginning to emulate, not out of humanitarian concern, but from recognition that terrorized slaves were less productive than those who were treated with basic dignity. His approach emphasized economic incentives rather than physical punishment, creating an atmosphere where resistance seemed less necessary while still maintaining the fundamental inequality that defined the institution of slavery. "Production's up 18% since we changed our management methods," Master Whitmore reported during a meeting of plantation owners that I overheard while serving refreshments. "Turns out that slaves who aren't constantly terrorized work harder and cause fewer problems than those who are kept in perpetual fear." The economic argument was compelling enough to convince practical men who might have resisted appeals to morality or humanitarian sentiment, while the continued reports of accidental deaths among brutal overseers provided additional motivation for adopting management techniques that emphasized carrots rather than sticks. But beneath the surface calculations of profit and loss, a deeper transformation was occurring in the relationship between master and slave throughout the region. Young Samuel had become my most accomplished student in what we continued to call precision work, though his damaged hands had prevented him from achieving the fine motor control necessary for detailed needlework. Instead, he had developed expertise in anatomical knowledge and opportunity recognition that made him valuable as an instructor for others who needed to understand the principles that could transform domestic tools into instruments of liberation. "The important thing to remember," he explained to Rebecca during one of her visits from the Frankfurt plantation, "is that success depends on understanding your materials completely. Whether you're working with fabric or other substances, precision is more important than force." His coded instruction was masterful in its subtlety, providing information that could be applied to eliminating the overseer who had made Rebecca's life unbearable while maintaining the appearance of routine domestic education. The knowledge that was being transmitted through these carefully disguised lessons was spreading faster than authorities could track or suppress it, carried by women who traveled between plantations on legitimate household business while sharing intelligence about vulnerable targets and effective techniques. Martha had become our unofficial intelligence coordinator, using her position as senior house slave to gather information about the movements and habits of white authority figures while maintaining the facade of grateful servitude that made such observation possible. Her network of contacts throughout the domestic staffs of neighboring plantations provided early warning about potential threats while identifying opportunities for expanding our resistance activities. "Heard from Sarah at the Pemberton place," she reported during one of our evening planning sessions. "Their overseer's been asking questions about household security, wants to know if any of the house slaves have been acting suspicious lately. But Sarah says he's so nervous about the accidents that have been happening that he jumps at every unexpected sound." The psychological impact of the resistance was proving to be as significant as its practical effects, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty among plantation management personnel who were beginning to understand that their positions might not provide the security they had always assumed was guaranteed by law and social convention. The knowledge that even the most brutal authority could be eliminated through methods that left no evidence for investigation was transforming the fundamental dynamics of plantation life. But the most important development was the emergence of what could only be called a movement, a coordinated network of resistance that operated through principles rather than central command, connected by shared knowledge about precision and opportunity rather than formal organizational structure. The techniques that had eliminated Hartwell were being adapted and refined by women throughout the region who had learned to see ordinary household objects as potential weapons waiting to be employed by someone with sufficient anatomical knowledge and perfect timing. The reports that filtered through our intelligence network painted a picture of systematic change occurring throughout the slave-holding regions of Kentucky, Tennessee, and beyond. Cruel overseers were retiring early or dying in accidents with increasing frequency, while plantation owners were finding it difficult to recruit replacements willing to employ the innovative punishment techniques that had once been considered marks of professional competence. "Can't keep good supervisors anymore," complained Judge Morrison during a legal consultation with Master Whitmore that I overheard while cleaning the study. "Experienced men are demanding contracts that specifically limit their liability for accidents, while younger candidates won't even consider positions on plantations known for harsh discipline methods." The economic pressures created by the resistance were forcing fundamental changes in labor management practices throughout the region, as plantation owners discovered that the reign of terror, which had once seemed essential for controlling their human property, was becoming counterproductive when it made qualified supervisors impossible to retain. The systematic elimination of brutal authorities was creating space for more humane treatment of enslaved people, not through moral persuasion, but through practical necessity. As spring approached and the planting season demanded intensive labor coordination, I reflected on the changes that had transformed not just individual plantations, but the entire landscape of slavery in central Kentucky. The sewing needle that had ended Hartwell's life had become a symbol that extended far beyond its original purpose, representing principles that could be applied to circumstances throughout the region where slaves found themselves trapped under the authority of men who viewed human suffering as entertainment. The knowledge that resistance was possible had spread through networks that had always connected enslaved communities, but which now carried information that transcended conventional understanding of what such resistance might achieve. The demonstration that even the most brutal oppressor could be eliminated through careful planning and precise action had fundamentally altered the psychological relationship between master and slave, creating possibilities that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. But perhaps most importantly, the success of what had begun as personal vengeance had revealed the vulnerability of systems that had seemed unchangeable to previous generations of enslaved people. The elimination of individual oppressors was creating systemic changes that went far beyond the simple replacement of cruel personnel with more moderate supervisors, affecting the fundamental assumptions about power and control that made plantation slavery economically viable. I was 36 years old, and I had learned that the smallest instruments could indeed deliver justice that resonated far beyond their original targets, that quiet acts of resistance could echo through networks that connected enslaved communities across vast distances, that a simple sewing needle could become the seed of transformation that challenged the basic structures of human oppression. The thread of my desperation had been woven into a pattern that extended throughout the region, connecting women who had learned to see precision as power, patience as strategy, and ordinary objects as weapons of liberation, waiting to be employed by someone who understood their deadly potential. The needle's echo would continue to resonate through generations of people who remembered that even the most carefully controlled victims could become dangerous when the right moment aligned with the perfect opportunity. Thomas Hartwell's death had been more than the elimination of one brutal overseer. It had been the demonstration that resistance could take forms that no amount of security could prevent, that knowledge properly applied could overcome advantages of size and strength and legal authority, that justice could be delivered through methods so subtle they remained invisible until the moment of their employment. The pattern was complete, woven from threads of accumulated suffering and systematic oppression. into a design that revealed the vulnerability of those who had seemed invincible. The sewing room where it had all begun continued to serve its original purpose, producing beautiful garments for people who had no idea that the hands which created such delicate beauty had also delivered the most precise justice that Kentucky plantation country had ever witnessed. But the true masterpiece was not any single garment, but the network of knowledge that had spread from that room to transform the landscape of slavery throughout the region. The smallest instrument had delivered the greatest justice, and its echo would continue to resonate through the corridors of history as proof that even the most systematic oppression contained the seeds of its own destruction, waiting only for someone with sufficient intelligence and determination to recognize them and nurture them into instruments of liberation. This was the story of Clara of Kentucky, the enslaved woman who killed overseer Thomas Hartwell with a sewing needle on a winter afternoon in 1835, delivering justice so precisely that his death appeared to be a tragic accident rather than deliberate elimination of one of the region's most brutal authorities. Her act of resistance sparked what became known as the Needle Network, a system of knowledge sharing among enslaved women throughout Kentucky and beyond that used domestic tools as weapons while maintaining complete secrecy through coded instruction disguised as household management education. The systematic elimination of cruel overseers that followed created labor shortages and economic pressures that forced plantation owners to adopt more humane management practices, not from moral conviction, but from practical necessity when qualified supervisors became impossible to recruit or retain. Clara's demonstration that even the most brutal authority could be eliminated through careful planning and precise action transformed the psychological relationship between enslaved people and their oppressors throughout the region, revealing vulnerabilities in systems of control that had seemed unchangeable to previous generations. She lived to see the end of slavery in 1865, spending her later years teaching needlework to freed women while privately sharing knowledge about precision and anatomy that had once served far deadlier purposes than embroidery. The techniques she developed continued to be passed down through networks that connected women across the South, serving as a reminder that resistance could take forms that no amount of security could prevent when ordinary objects were transformed into instruments of liberation by someone who understood their deadly potential. The echoes of Clara's precise resistance thread through time, a testament to intelligence triumphing over brute force. If these untold stories of quiet revolution stir your soul, join our community. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of American slavery. Your support helps us keep these powerful narratives alive, ensuring that the voices of those who turned the smallest tools into the mightiest weapons will never be forgotten.